In 1993, Royce Gracie annihilated the competition in the very first UFC. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the real deal. Royce went on to win UFC 2 and 4, he was injured in 3. How did he do it? Where did this martial art come from? Here is the story of how BJJ was born. To understand where we are today, we're going to take a journey back into the depth of history, and look at the beginning. Around the year 1333 in Japan, the main form of combat was samurais on horseback with swords, and other types of weapons you think of when we think of old wars. Jiu-Jitsu was the samurai's last line of defense if they were knocked off of horseback or disarmed. We need to remember the samurai were armored, so movement was restricted. If you could ground your opponent, it would be difficult for them to stand and thus give you a great advantage. This made throws very important along with joint locks and strangles. The earliest record of the word jiu-jitsu is in 1532 when the first school of jiu-jitsu was established in Japan. As Japan moves from the feudal era of the samurai with swords and technological advances, the invention of the firearm means warriors learning hand-to-hand combat for the battlefield becomes less important. Jiu-jitsu was still practiced, but it was hazardous. Full contact resulted in common injuries. In the 1800s, Kano Jigoro, who was a practitioner of jiu-jitsu, realized there must be a better, safer way to practice this art. He started introducing rules and focusing on select techniques, and this form of the art becomes known as Kano Jiu-Jitsu. As the martial art delves further from its roots, students of Kano Jiu-Jitsu were able to practice far more frequently due to the lack of injury. And what happens when you train more often? You get better. Kano Jiu-Jitsu becomes further removed from its roots in Jiu-Jitsu and gets renamed Kodokan Judo. The rules of judo are now very different from its ancestral parent martial art, with striking and other techniques such as groin strikes and elbows removed to allow participants to practice safely. In 1914, as part of a significant Japanese immigration to Brazil, a man named Mitsuyo Maeda, one of Kano's students, immigrates to Brazil. Maeda becomes friends with an influential businessman in Brazil who helped him establish himself. Maeda, in gratitude, offers to teach the businessman's son the art of jiu-jitsu. At this point in history, judo and jiu-jitsu were used interchangeably. The businessman was Gaston Gracie and his firstborn Carlos Gracie. Now we are getting quite close to Royce Gracie, so it's important to understand the Gracie family and their importance. We have Gaston Gracie, who had lots of children. The two of note for us today are Carlos Gracie and Helio Gracie. The other siblings had a huge part to play in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as we know it, but today we are focusing on these two. Royce Gracie is from the lineage of Helio, so we'll explore that lineage first. Helio was a small skinny man, but the temperament of a giant. His style of jiu-jitsu was to promote that a smaller man could beat and submit a larger man. Looking back at Helio's matches, we can see he often got to the guard. Here he would find a submission or sweep then sub. As Helio was often smaller than his opponents, his matches often lasted a long time, often lasting hours. Carlos Gracie was a fighter in his own right, and just like his younger brother Helio, Carlos would travel and fight, but of note in this lineage is Carlos's first son, Carlson Gracie. Carlson's vision of jiu-jitsu didn't quite align with that of his uncle. Carlson had a much more ruthless approach to fighting. Carlson Gracie was a powerfully built man, and his whole ethos was get on top and smash. Some of the top MMA schools in the world today are from the lineage of Carlson Gracie. Where Helio Gracie often wanted to restrict rules to jiu-jitsu, Carlson would much prefer Vale Tudo rules. Horion Gracie and some friends came up with an idea. At the time, the Gracie family were challenging anyone in the world with any form of martial art training to come and fight. Horion's idea was to have an 8-man tournament. The first event had wrestlers, kickboxers, karate experts, shoot fighters, a sumo wrestler and one Royce Gracie, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. The first event was November 12, 1993, and Royce Gracie would take down and submit all his opponents. A new star was born. Royce would win UFC 2 and 4. He was injured for UFC 3 and had to withdraw. The Carlson Gracie Sr. lineage is important, that is where Game Fight Bradford starts. Carlson Gracie Sr. had a student, Walter Guimarães, who gave Professor Vinicius his black belt. Carlson Gracie Sr. and Walter Guimarães tied the black belt around Professor Vinicius' waist. Mabsi Alam got his black belt from Professor Vinicius. If you want to hear more about this, check out our The Flow State podcast with Coach Mabsi. So, this leads us to the present day. And this is our lineage to the Gracies. Carlos Gracie was the first to learn jiu-jitsu from Maeda. And Carlos had a son called Carlson. Carlson taught Walter Guimarães, who taught Vinicius. Professor Vinicius promoted Coach Mabsi to black belt, and Coach Mabsi promoted Coach Barber, and that leads down to me, Sensei Bob.